The first body was smiling. I need you to understand what that means. 5 bodies floating face down in the black water of Turner Creek, arranged in a perfect line like someone had laid them out for Sunday service, arms folded, eyes closed. But when we turned them over, every single one had their lips stretched back from their teeth in a grin that belonged on no dead man's face. Something had arranged them, posed them, taken the time to fold their hands across their chests, and then stood back, I think, to admire its work. The Seminole guides took one look and pulled their dugouts back toward deeper water. Wouldn't say why. Just shook their heads and made signs I didn't recognize. One of them, an old man named Charlie Billy, spat into the water and said a single word in Mikosuke. The way he said it made my skin crawl. 4 of us went into that swamp to document the untouched heart of the Everglades. 3 of us came out. My name is Dr. Harold Fenn. I led that expedition in the summer of 1933, 47 years ago now. I've kept silent about what happened out there, watched the university bury my report, watched the newspapers dismiss Cypress Joe's disappearance as another casualty of Florida's unforgiving wilderness. I'm 79 years old. My heart's failing, and the doctors tell me I have months, not years. When I die, the truth dies with me. And I've decided that's not acceptable. This is what happened in the Everglades in July of 1933. This is what took our guide. This is what I see every night when I close my eyes, standing at the edge of black water with its enormous hands reaching toward me. The expedition began, like most academic disasters, with the best of intentions. The University of Miami's Natural History Department had received a substantial grant to document the interior wetlands of South Florida before the Army Corps of Engineers could drain them into submission. This was 1933, remember? The Everglades stretched unbroken from Lake Okeechobee to Florida Bay, a river of grass 40 miles wide and deeper than most people understood. No roads, no settlements, just sawgrass prairie and cypress swamp and hammocks of hardwood trees rising like islands from water that reflected the sky so perfectly you couldn't tell where earth ended and heaven began. I was 32 then, an assistant professor of biology with more ambition than sense. The university selected me to lead a small team deep into the interior, to the places where no white man had set foot since the Seminole Wars. We would document flora and fauna, map water systems, and photograph whatever wonders we found in that liquid wilderness. The team was small by necessity. Dr. Margaret Chen, our botanist, a brilliant woman from Chicago who could identify a plant species from 50 yards and wasn't afraid to wade through snake-infested water to collect specimens. James Rooker, our photographer, barely 25 but already renowned for his work, documenting the vanishing wilderness of the American South. And Thomas Whitmore, a graduate student in anthropology who spoke passable Spanish and had convinced me he could handle the physical demands of swamp travel. We hired Cypress Joe through contacts at the Tamiami Trail Trading Post, a sun-baked collection of buildings where the new highway crossed the northern edge of the wetlands. His real name was Joseph Osceola, but everyone called him Cypress Joe because of the way he could navigate the maze of cypress swamps that covered the interior like a vast flooded forest. He was 60 years old, a lean man with hands like leather and eyes the color of dark water. He had guided hunters and scientists through the Everglades for 3 decades without losing a single client. The trading post owner, a weathered cracker named Billy Weeks, vouched for Joe's competence but warned us about traveling so deep into the interior during the wet season. "That's Seminole country," he said, sweat beading on his forehead despite the early morning hour. "They don't mind you passing through. But there's places in there they won't go themselves. Old places. You understand what I'm saying?" I didn't understand. Not then. I thought he was talking about sacred sites, burial grounds, the sort of cultural sensitivities we'd been briefed to respect. I assured him we had no intention of disturbing any archaeological sites. Billy Weeks looked at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "That ain't what I'm talking about, Professor. But I guess you'll figure it out." Cypress Joe loaded our supplies into his airboat with practiced efficiency. We had food for 10 days, camera equipment sealed in waterproof cases, specimen jars, and enough camping gear to establish a base camp in the heart of the wetlands. The plan was simple. Pole deeper into the swamp than any previous expedition had managed, document what we found, and return with photographs and specimens that would secure funding for future research. Joe fired up the airboat's engine, a deafening roar that scattered every bird within a mile. As we pulled away from the dock, I felt that peculiar mixture of excitement and nervousness that comes with crossing from the known world into the unknown. The last civilized structure disappeared behind us within minutes, swallowed by a wall of sawgrass taller than a man's head. The Everglades in July is not a comfortable place for human beings. The temperature climbs toward 90 degrees before sunrise and stays there until well after dark. The humidity wraps around you like a wet wool blanket, making every breath feel insufficient. Mosquitoes rise from the water in clouds thick enough to darken the air, and they're joined by biting flies, no-see-ums, and creatures whose names I never learned, but whose bites left welts that took weeks to heal. But there was beauty in it too. Beauty that took your breath away and made you forget, for moments at a time, how miserable you were. Great blue herons standing motionless in the shallows, their reflections perfect in the still water. Alligators basking on mudbanks, ancient and patient as fallen logs. Anhinga birds perched on cypress branches with their wings spread to dry, looking like something from the age of dinosaurs. And the silence. When Joe cut the engine to pull through narrow channels, the silence was complete in a way I'd never experienced. No traffic, no machinery. No human sounds at all except our own breathing and the soft splash of the pole pushing against the muddy bottom. It was the silence of a world that existed before man and would exist after we were gone. We traveled south for 6 hours that first day, following channels that wound through sawgrass prairie and past islands of cabbage palm and live oak draped with Spanish moss. Joe navigated by signs I couldn't read, the direction of bird flights, the way certain grasses bent in the current, subtle changes in watercolor that meant nothing to me but told him exactly where we were. By evening, we had reached what Joe called the Big Cypress. The sawgrass prairie gave way to a forest of towering bald cypress trees, their buttressed trunks rising from black water like the columns of some ancient cathedral. Spanish moss hung from the branches in curtains, and the canopy grew so thick overhead that even in broad daylight, the water below existed in perpetual twilight. Joe guided us to a small island, a hammock of solid ground, perhaps 50 yards across and covered with live oaks and strangler figs. We made camp there, stringing our tents between the trees and setting up a cooking fire on the sandy soil. The island felt secure, isolated from the surrounding swamp by 20 yards of open water on all sides. That first evening passed pleasantly enough. Margaret collected plant specimens by lantern light, cataloging species she'd never seen outside of textbooks. Rooker photographed the camp setup and the ancient trees surrounding us. Thomas interviewed Joe about Seminole methods for navigating the wetlands, taking careful notes in a leather-bound journal. Joe was talkative that first night, sharing stories of the old days when hunters came south to collect plumes from snowy egrets and great white herons before the Audubon Society and federal law put an end to the trade. He spoke of the early Seminole settlements, hidden deep in the swamp where federal troops could never find them, of panthers and bears and vast flocks of birds that darkened the sky during migration season. "This place got memory," Joe said, poking the fire with a cypress stick. "Longer memory than any man. The water remember everything that ever happened here, every footstep, every voice, every death." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he might have commented on the weather or the thickness of the mosquitoes. But something in his tone made us all look up from our various tasks. "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, pencil poised over his notebook. Joe was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "Some places, the old ones still live. Not Indian, older than Indian. They was here before the water rose, before the peninsula took shape. They remember when this was all dry land, when different creatures walked here." Margaret looked up from her plant press. "You're talking about indigenous peoples, pre-Columbian settlements?" Joe shook his head. "Not people. Not like us. Different kind of life, but they still here, still watching." He looked around our small camp, his eyes moving from tent to tent, then out toward the dark water beyond the firelight. "They don't mind you passing through, but some places they don't like strangers staying too long. making noise, taking things that ain't yours to take. Thomas was scribbling frantically, excited to be recording authentic folklore. What do these beings look like? How do they make themselves known? But Joe had said all he intended to say. He stood, stretched, and began preparing his bedroll. "We got long days ahead," he said. "Best get some sleep." I should have pressed him for details, should have asked more questions, but I was tired from the day's travel, and I dismissed his stories as the sort of colorful local folklore that guides often shared with their clients. Every wilderness had its legends, its cautionary tales about respecting the land and not venturing too far from civilization. I would remember his words differently after what happened on the third night. The second day took us deeper into the Big Cypress, through channels so narrow that cypress knees scraped the sides of our boat and Spanish moss brushed our faces like ghostly fingers. The water grew blacker, stained with tannins from decaying vegetation, until it looked like strong coffee. The air smelled of rich earth and decay, that distinctive wetland smell that gets into your clothes and hair and stays there for weeks. Joe pulled us through the maze of trees with unnerving skill, choosing channels that often seemed to lead nowhere, but somehow connected to other waterways deeper in the swamp. I began to understand how the Seminoles had evaded federal forces for so long. This was not country where you could move an army. A single man with a rifle could hold off dozens of soldiers simply by knowing which channels led to dead ends and which connected to escape routes. We stopped frequently for Margaret to collect specimens and for Rooker to photograph the towering trees and their hanging gardens of air plants. The diversity was staggering. I counted 7 species of ferns I'd never seen before, orchids growing wild on cypress bark, and bromeliads the size of bushes collecting rainwater in their central cups. But as the day wore on, I began to notice things that made me uneasy. Small things, individually meaningless but collectively disturbing. The bird sounds, which had been constant during our first day, grew sporadic and then stopped entirely around midday. The water, which had been teeming with fish and turtles, became empty. Even the ever-present alligators, which had been basking on every available surface, seemed to have vanished. Joe noticed too. I could tell by the way he held his head as he polled, listening for sounds I couldn't hear. His movements became more careful, more deliberate. He tested each channel before committing to it, sometimes backing out and choosing a different route for reasons he didn't share. Around 3 in the afternoon, we came upon something that made us all stare in silence. 5 enormous cypress trees had fallen across a narrow channel, their trunks forming a perfect barrier from bank to bank. But these were not trees that had fallen naturally. Each trunk had been twisted off about 10 feet above the waterline, the wood splintered and torn in ways that suggested enormous force applied suddenly. And they had been arranged, positioned with their broken ends pointing in the same direction, toward the deeper swamp. "Storm damage?" I asked, though the pattern seemed too deliberate for weather. Joe pulled closer to examine the barrier. Up close, the violence that had created it was even more apparent. The cypress wood was tough as iron, resistant to everything except fire and decades of water damage. Whatever had twisted these trees off their trunks and arranged them across the channel had possessed strength beyond anything in nature. And there was something else, marks in the splintered wood that looked almost like fingerprints. 5 deep gouges in each trunk, parallel lines that could have been made by claws or fingernails, if fingernails could be 6 inches long and sharp enough to score solid wood. "We need to find another way," Joe said quietly. He was already backing the boat away from the barrier, his eyes scanning the tree line on both sides of the channel. "Why?" Thomas asked. "We could probably clear a path through." "No." Joe's voice carried a finality that silenced further discussion. "We don't move those trees. We don't touch anything here." He pulled us back to a junction we'd passed 20 minutes earlier and chose a different channel, one that curved away from the barrier and deeper into the swamp. But I noticed he kept looking over his shoulder, watching our back trail as if something might be following. We made camp that second night on another hammock, this one smaller and less comfortable than the first. The trees grew closer together, and Spanish moss hung so thick it was like being inside a tent made of cobwebs. The fire seemed smaller, its light swallowed by the vegetation before it could push back the darkness. Joe was quiet during dinner, answering questions with single words and volunteering nothing. When Thomas tried to ask about the fallen trees, Joe simply shook his head and turned away. It was Margaret who first noticed the smell. We were sitting around the fire, planning the next day's route, when she lifted her head and sniffed the air like a dog catching a scent. "Do you smell that?" she asked. I inhaled deeply. At first, I caught only the usual swamp odors, rotting vegetation, stagnant water, the green smell of growing things. But then it came again, carried on a shift in the barely perceptible breeze. Something wrong, something that made my stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. "What is that?" Rooker asked. He was holding his hand over his nose and mouth. The smell was thick, organic, like meat left too long in the sun. But there was something else mixed with it, something wild and musky that reminded me of the big cat house at the zoo, but stronger, much stronger. It rolled across our campsite in waves, carried by the humid night air until it seemed to coat the back of my throat. Joe stood slowly from his position by the fire. His face had gone very still, very alert. He was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. "Everyone stay by the fire," he said quietly. "Don't move. Don't make noise." The smell grew stronger. And then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond our small island, came a sound that raised every hair on my neck. It started as a low rumble, so deep I felt it more than heard it. Like distant thunder, but continuous, rising and falling with the rhythm of breathing. As it grew louder, it resolved into something that was part growl, part groan, part vocalization from a throat that had never been designed for human speech. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the water and bouncing between the cypress trunks until I couldn't tell which direction it originated from. But it was close, very close. Joe picked up a burning brand from the fire and held it high, scanning the tree line that surrounded our small island. The flames threw dancing shadows between the trunks, creating shapes that looked almost like movement in the darkness beyond. "What is it?" I whispered. Joe didn't answer immediately. He was turning slowly, keeping the torch raised, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Esti Kapkaki," he said, "the tall man." The sound came again, closer now, and with it, something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins, the splash of something large moving through the water, something that displaced enough liquid to send ripples lapping against the shore of our island. Something that was definitely not an alligator or any other creature that belonged in this swamp. Joe said something in Mikosuke, a rapid string of words that sounded like prayer or plea or warning. Then he looked at each of us in turn, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen there before. Fear. Real, primal terror. "Nobody move," he said again. "Whatever you see, whatever you hear, stay here, stay in the light." But even as he spoke, the cypress trees at the edge of our island began to move, not sway in the breeze. There was no breeze. Move. Shake. As if something massive was brushing against them from the other side, something tall enough to disturb branches 20 feet above the water. The shaking moved from tree to tree, circling our small camp. Whatever was out there was walking around us, studying us, taking its time. And then, impossibly, we heard it breathe. A long, slow inhalation that seemed to draw all the air from the swamp. A pause that stretched until my lungs ached in sympathy. Then an exhalation like wind through a cavern, carrying that horrible smell directly over our fire. Joe dropped the torch. It hit the sand with a shower of sparks, and for a moment, our world contracted to the small circle of firelight, beyond which anything might exist. "Jesus Christ," Thomas whispered, and from the darkness beyond the trees, something answered, not words, not human speech, but a sound that was definitely a response, a vocalization that carried intelligence and intent, and something that might have been amusement. The sound a predator makes when it realizes its prey has finally understood the nature of the game. That's when the footprints appeared. The footprints materialized in the sand at the edge of our firelight as we watched. Not pressed down by visible weight, but appearing as if the sand itself remembered something massive stepping there moments before. Each print was enormous, easily 18 inches long and proportioned like a human foot, but wrong in every detail that mattered. The toes were too long, ending in what looked like claw marks. The arch was too high. The heels showed a depth that spoke of tremendous weight distributed across a surface area that shouldn't have been able to support it. The prints formed a rough circle around our camp, each one appearing in sequence as whatever made them completed its survey of our small island. When the circle closed, the footprints stopped appearing. But the presence didn't leave. It was watching us. Rooker fumbled for his camera, hands shaking as he tried to adjust the settings for night photography. "We have to document this," he whispered. "Nobody will believe—" "Don't," Joe said sharply. "No pictures, no sounds, nothing that draws attention." But Rooker's flash had already fired, a brilliant white explosion that illuminated our camp and the surrounding trees for a single frozen moment. In that instant of artificial daylight, I saw something that will haunt me until my dying breath. Standing between two cypress trees at the edge of the water, perhaps 30 yards from our fire, was a figure that shouldn't exist. It stood upright like a man but towered above the Spanish moss, easily 9 feet tall. Its body was covered in coarse hair that looked black in the brief flash of light, but its proportions were all wrong. The arms hung past the knees, the shoulders were too broad, the head was too large and sat too far forward on the neck. But it was the eyes that destroyed my rational mind. They reflected the camera flash like an animal's, but they held intelligence. Ancient, patient intelligence that had been watching human beings for longer than our species had recorded history. They looked at us not as prey, but as something infinitely smaller and less significant than prey. The way you might look at ants before deciding whether to step around them or simply continue walking. The flash faded. Darkness reclaimed the swamp. But the afterimage burned in my vision, and I knew the others had seen it too. Thomas was making a sound low in his throat, not quite a moan, but close. Margaret had gone completely rigid, her breathing shallow and rapid, and Rooker was reaching for his camera again. "One more shot," he whispered. "I need to get the exposure right." Joe lunged for him, but he was too late. The second flash fired, strobing across the water and trees with merciless clarity. The space between the cypress trees was empty. But something roared from directly behind us. I spun around and found myself staring up at the thing from a distance of perhaps 10 feet. It had moved while the afterimages danced in our eyes, circled our camp with silence that belonged to no creature of its size. Up close, the wrongness was overwhelming. The face was almost human, but stretched and elongated like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. The jaw protruded too far. The nose was flattened, with nostrils that flared wide as it breathed, and those eyes, those terrible, intelligent eyes, looked down at us with what I can only describe as disappointment. It had given us a chance to be quiet, to be respectful, to pass through its territory without causing offense. And we had failed the test. The creature reached out with one enormous hand and plucked Rooker's camera from his grasp. The motion was almost gentle, like an adult taking a toy from a misbehaving child. Then, it crushed the camera between its fingers. Metal and glass crumpled with sounds like breaking bones. Rooker made a choking sound and stumbled backward. His foot hit something in the sand and he fell hard, landing on his back with the creature looming over him. For a moment I thought it would kill him then and there. Its other hand moved toward his face with fingers spread wide, but Joe stepped forward. He said something in Mikosuke, a long string of words delivered in the tone of formal address or ritual greeting. The creature's head turned toward him, and I saw recognition in its expression, not friendship, but acknowledgement. The way one might acknowledge a neighbor with whom relations are cordial, but distant. Joe continued speaking, his voice steady despite the terror I could see in the set of his shoulders. He gestured toward us, then toward himself, then toward the deeper swamp. The creature listened with the patience of something that had learned human languages when they were still new. When Joe finished, the creature made a sound that was almost conversational. A series of grunts and growls that carried the cadence of speech, punctuated by gestures of its own. It pointed at Rooker, then at the broken camera, then back toward the way we'd come. Its meaning was clear, even to those of us who didn't speak either language involved in this negotiation. The outsiders had shown disrespect. They should leave. Joe nodded and said something else. The creature considered this, its massive head tilting like a dog trying to understand a complicated command. Then it made what I swear was a sound of amusement and stepped backward into the darkness. But it didn't leave. I could feel its presence just beyond the firelight, waiting to see what we would do. "Pack everything," Joe said quietly. "We're leaving. Now." "It's the middle of the night," Margaret protested. "How can we navigate in the dark?" "Better than we can negotiate with Kapkaki if he loses patience," Joe replied. He was already rolling up his bedding with economical movements. "Trust me, we need to be gone before he decides we've stayed too long." We broke camp in 15 minutes, working by the light of burning branches torn from our fire. The creature watched us the entire time. I could feel its eyes tracking our movements, evaluating our compliance with its unspoken demand. When we loaded the last of our gear into the boat, it made that sound again, the one that might have been amusement or approval. Joe pulled us away from the island and into the maze of channels, navigating by starlight and senses I couldn't fathom. Behind us, something large splashed in the water near our abandoned campsite, testing the scents we'd left behind, perhaps, making sure we were really gone. "What was that thing?" Thomas asked when we'd traveled far enough that normal conversation seemed safe again. Joe was quiet for a long time, concentrating on reading the waterway in near total darkness. When he finally answered, his voice carried the weight of old knowledge passed down through generations. "Seminole got stories going back to before the white man came, before the Spanish, before anyone kept written records. Stories about the first people who lived in this land, when it was different, drier, when there were creatures here that don't exist no more, and others that learned to hide when the world changed around them." He guided us through a narrow passage between two stands of cypress, their branches meeting overhead like the roof of a cathedral. Kapkaki, the tall man, he's old. Older than the Everglades. Older than the rising water. His people, they was here when this was all dry land, when different animals walked these trails. When the world changed, when the ice melted and the sea rose, most of them died out. But some learned to live in the new world, learned to hide, learned to stay away from the new people who came later. "You're talking about a relict population," Margaret said, her scientific training asserting itself despite everything we'd just witnessed. "A surviving member of some unknown species. I'm talking about something that remembers when your ancestors were still afraid of fire," Joe interrupted. "Something that's been watching human beings learn to walk upright and make tools and build cities. Something that's seen empires rise and fall and knows that you and me and everyone we've ever known are just another short season in a much longer story." We traveled through the night, following channels that seemed to lead in circles but gradually carried us away from the deep interior of the swamp. Joe navigated by subtle signs I couldn't read, the slant of starlight on water, the direction of imperceptible currents, the call of night birds that had slowly resumed their songs as we put distance between ourselves and the tall man's territory. Dawn found us in more familiar surroundings, where the cypress forest gave way to sawgrass prairie and the water ran clearer. Joe finally allowed us to stop for breakfast on a small hammock crowned with cabbage palms. We ate in silence, each of us processing what we'd experienced in our own way. Rooker seemed the most shaken. He kept looking at his hands, flexing his fingers as if surprised they still worked. The loss of his camera was more than professional disappointment. It was proof that the encounter had been real, that something had reached out of the darkness and demonstrated its casual dominance over our technology, our plans, our very presence in its world. "We're going back," I said finally. "Today. No more exploration. No more documentation." Nobody argued. The return journey took most of the day, retracing channels that seemed different in daylight, familiar but charged with new significance. I found myself studying every stand of trees, every shadowed passage, wondering what else might be watching from just beyond the edge of vision. Joe pulled steadily but kept his eyes moving, scanning the tree line and testing the air for scents that might signal trouble. We saw no more signs of the tall man, but his presence had changed the entire character of the swamp for us. What had seemed like pristine wilderness the day before now felt actively inhabited by intelligence older and more patient than our own. We were not explorers documenting virgin territory. We were trespassers in a land that tolerated our passage but did not welcome it. The trading post at Tamiami Trail appeared like a vision of civilization when we finally reached it that evening. Electric lights, the sound of automobiles on the new highway, the mundane conversations of people who had never seen anything more threatening than an alligator. Billy Weeks helped us unload our gear and equipment, making no comment about our shortened expedition or our obvious haste to reach safety. "Find what you were looking for out there?" he asked as Joe secured the airboat. "More than we expected," I replied. Weeks nodded knowingly. "That country's got its own ways. Always has." The return trip to Miami should have been a relief. Hot showers, clean beds, proper meals after days of camp food and swamp water. But that first night in the hotel, lying in air-conditioned comfort, I found myself listening for sounds that didn't belong. The whisper of Spanish moss against the windows, the splash of something large moving through water, the patient breathing of a presence just beyond the edge of perception. I filed my preliminary report with the university the next morning, describing our botanical discoveries and documenting the species Margaret had cataloged. I made no mention of the fallen trees, the footprints, or our encounter with something that scientific taxonomy had no name for. How could I? Who would have believed such a report from a respected professor of biology? The official expedition summary, published 6 months later in the university's Research Quarterly, described a successful documentation of previously unstudied plant communities in the interior Everglades. Rooker's photographs, the ones he'd managed to take before his camera was destroyed, accompanied articles about the diversity of epiphytic orchids and the complex ecosystem relationships within cypress swamps. The expedition was deemed a scientific success, but there were stories that never made it into any official report. Thomas Whitmore left graduate school 3 months after our return. He claimed academic burnout, but I saw him once at a conference 2 years later. He'd developed a nervous habit of checking over his shoulder when he spoke, as if something might be approaching from behind. When I tried to engage him in conversation about the expedition, he made an excuse and left the room. Margaret Chen continued her botanical research, but never again ventured into unexplored wilderness. She took positions at established research stations, places where the flora was well documented and the local fauna posed no surprises. She published prolifically for 15 years, but I noticed that none of her papers dealt with fieldwork in remote locations. James Rooker never recovered from the loss of his camera and the photographs it contained. He became obsessed with documenting what he called cryptid encounters, traveling to remote locations around the world with increasingly sophisticated equipment. He was found dead in the Canadian wilderness in 1947, apparently killed by a bear. But the investigating officers noted that his expensive cameras were missing and his body showed injuries inconsistent with typical bear attacks. Cypress Joe continued guiding scientists and hunters through the Everglades until his death in 1962. But I learned from Billy Weeks that he never again took clients into the deep interior, the places where the old cypress forest met the sawgrass prairie. When asked about it, he would say only that some areas were closed for the season. The season never reopened. As for me, I built a respectable career in biology, published papers on wetland ecology, and taught undergraduate courses in field research techniques. But I never again led an expedition into truly unexplored territory. I told myself it was a practical decision, that my expertise was better utilized in laboratory settings and established field stations. The truth was simpler. I had seen something in that swamp that challenged every assumption I held about the natural world and humanity's place in it. I had looked into eyes that remembered when my species was young and vulnerable, when we huddled around fires in the darkness and told stories about things that watched us from just beyond the reach of flame. And I had realized that some of those stories were true. I'm 86 years old now. The doctors tell me my heart is giving out, that I have weeks rather than months. The nightmares have faded over the decades, but they've never completely stopped. Sometimes I still wake in the darkness, listening for the sound of something large, breathing just outside my window, testing the air for that wild, musky scent that belongs to no creature in any zoological text. The Everglades are different now. The Army Corps of Engineers succeeded in draining vast sections of the wetlands, channeling the ancient sheet flow into concrete canals, and turning sawgrass prairie into shopping centers and subdivisions. The river of grass has been reduced to a fraction of its original size, confined to national parks and wildlife refuges where tourists can safely observe alligators and wading birds from designated boardwalks. But the deep places remain. The Big Cypress still exists, protected now by federal law and accessible only to those with special permits and local guides. I wonder sometimes what still lives there, in the cathedral spaces between towering trees where Spanish moss filters the light into green twilight. I wonder if patient eyes still watch from the shadows, if ancient intelligence still evaluates the worthiness of human visitors who venture too far from marked trails. I wonder if the tall man is still there, or if his kind has finally retreated beyond the reach of chainsaws and development into caves beneath the earth or valleys hidden in mountains where no roads will ever reach. I hope he is. I hope that somewhere in this increasingly small and mapped and documented world, there are still mysteries that resist explanation. Still guardians of places too important to be fully understood by minds as young and crude as ours. This is what happened in the Everglades in July of 1933. This is what I saw standing between the cypress trees, what reached out of the darkness to crush metal and glass with casual contempt. This is why I never went back to the deep places, why I built my career on the safe margins of human knowledge rather than pushing into territories where older rules apply. Make of it what you will. The truth is here now, set down in words before my memory of it dies with me. Whether you choose to believe it or dismiss it as the wanderings of an old man's failing mind is a decision I leave to you. But if you ever find yourself in the deep swamp, in the places where cypress trees tower overhead and Spanish moss filters the sunlight into something ancient and green, remember this story. Show respect to the inhabitants whose territory you're crossing. Keep your voices low and your cameras packed away. And if you catch that wild, musky scent on the humid air, if you hear the patient breathing of something large and intelligent in the darkness beyond your fire, do not seek it out. Some boundaries are meant to be respected. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. The tall man is still watching, still waiting, still remembering when this world was young and full of wonders that have no names in any human language. Let him keep his secrets. We are not ready for the truths they would teach us.